Maybe to begin, I think that if we're understanding both eternity and time as a divine procession or a divine energy, then it's harder to fall into a sort of dichotomy that you see more in the West between eternity and time. But I guess this question is probably more just to clarify what we mean by the divine energies. I think this is a more fundamental question about that. Um, and that is, so if we're saying that both eternity and time is a divine energy, from my understanding, the divine energies are, um, at least the ones that aren't associated specifically with creation, like love and being and wisdom, these are also eternal. So is there a sense in which, and then they wouldn't be, at least within the Godhead, they wouldn't be temporal. So is there a sense in which we have to still make some sort of distinction, not just in terms of, yes, they're distinct, like they're just different, but like almost in, like, for lack of a better term, like a qualitative distinction between the divine energy of eternity and the divine energy of time, because eternity seems to have a unique relationship with God, in the sense that God is eternal, and there is a sense in which God is uniquely eternal in a way that he is not temporal, at least in the way we are temporal. So, yeah, do you, and also one more question on that, which I think is related. Um, if God's energy is eternal, then we also have to say that I believe the other energies are also eternal. So I guess this is also a more fundamental question about the divine energies and how they, I guess, relate, or like perhaps even mutually penetrate each other, so that you can have being, which is, and life and wisdom, which are distinct from eternity, yet they're also eternal. So that's a more fundamental question on the nature of the divine energies and how they interrelate and perhaps mutually penetrate each other. And then the first question was about the difference between eternity and time, and how we have to understand these energies in relation to the Godhead.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so just to take the second question first, yeah, you're absolutely right that the energies do, you could say, interpenetrate, or maybe participate in one another. So life has being, right?
Mhm.
Um, and wisdom, you might say, is a form of life. It's a particular form of life that is only possible for rational creatures. Um, and both being and life and wisdom are all good. So they all, you could say either they participate in the first divine procession, which is goodness, or that they're forms of goodness, perhaps, if you want to put it that way.
Mhm.
Um, um, so yeah, as I think of it, this is kind of analogous to what Plato says about the weaving of the forms back in the Sophist. You know, he comes to this really crucial insight in his philosophy that whereas in the middle dialogues, like the Symposium and the Republic, he seemed to have treated each form sort of itself by itself with itself. You know, that's the phrase he uses in
Mhm.
in the Symposium, as sort of a distinct, independent reality. In the Sophist, he comes to realize, no, that he treats what he calls the five greatest kinds, which are being, sameness, difference, and motion and rest. And he says, well, being is different from motion, so being partakes of difference. But being is the same as itself, so it partakes of sameness. And sameness has being, and so does difference, right? So they partake of being. So there's sort of the reciprocal interweaving of the forms. So something similar among the processions, although they do have a distinct order, at least the way Dionysius puts them. So as to your first question about time in particular, yeah, you're right there as well, that time is linked to creation in a way that eternity is not. And there's a passage in John of Scythopolis, who was the first great commentator on Dionysius. He wrote Scholia on the Dionysian corpus. And let me just read a few sentences here that I quote in the paper. So this is John of Scythopolis. He says, thus also time, being once at rest in he who always is, God, shone forth in its descent, when later it was necessary for visible nature to come forth. In other words, in the act of creation. So the procession, and that's the same term Dionysius uses, the prootos, the procession of the goodness of God in creating sensible objects, we call time. Okay? So it's a kind of procession, but it's a procession that only comes forth in the act of creation. And that's unlike the procession of eternity, which is the divine life, right? Or characteristic of God, even independently of creating. But nonetheless, see, the thing that's important here, even though it comes forth in the act of creating, it is a divine procession. And it was once at rest in he who always is. Okay. And then it's shown forth when creation occurred. So it was sort of implicit within God already. And I think what he's doing here is adapting the idea from Plotinus, that Plotinus in turn gets from Plato and the Timaeus. You know, where Plato says time is the moving image of eternity, that time is a kind of an unfolding of what eternity is altogether all at once. So, and that, like I said, that's the intrinsic genetic relationship they have to each other, even though time in its manifest form is only a concomitant of creation. And of course, creation is something God chooses to do, right? It didn't have to exist. So in that sense, time is not necessary in the same way that eternity is.
Right. Yeah, and I think that Father Dumitru Staniloae in his essay Eternity and Time, I'm not sure if you had a chance to read it, but just for the audience, the way he understands time, I think really um provides a good explanation for what you were saying about how time isn't a bad thing the way like the Gnostics thought in other forms of other groups that aren't Christian, but time is an image of eternity, and for Staniloae, it's an image of eternity in the precise sense that for him, time is the interval of waiting between acts of love or movement towards another person. It's a personal reality for him in particular, and eternity is beyond time, not as like some sort of negation of time, so you don't get that dichotomy between eternity and time, but it's actually the fullness of time that transcends time, because in eternity, in God's eternity, the movement of each of the divine persons towards each other has no distance, so there's no interval of waiting, and therefore it's like this immediate presence of each of the divine persons in this perichoretic relationship, and that's God's eternity. And then we are called by God to enter into this eternity through becoming closer and closer and closer to Him, which is deification. So, and this is how, like what you were saying about how time is fundamentally good, but that doesn't mean everything that we do in time is good. And how Staniloae explains this is that when we sin, if we're understanding time as this communion, this movement towards another person, sin is actually the movement away from the other person. It's like the selfishness or pride. And this pride is actually, it occurs in time, but actually in its essence, if you can even speak of sin as having an essence, but what it is, it's a motion that negates time, because instead of moving towards another, it's actually this movement towards the self. It's what Maximus the Confessor calls self-love. So I'm just wondering if what you think about this understanding that Staniloae has, because I'm not sure if I haven't read as many as of the patristic writers as you have, but do you see this in the earlier fathers, or is it perhaps implicit in their understanding? Because I think that Staniloae specifically adds this I guess more of a personalistic aspect to it, which really, in my mind, really clarifies how we understand eternity, because it is this communion of the persons in that the immediate relationship of the Trinity. And I think it's just a really elegant way of understanding eternity and time. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts on it are.
Yeah. I did read most of that article just last night, and I was also very impressed. I thought, he's so simple and clear, but also very
Yeah.
profound.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
And Father Staniloae is almost like a modern father in not only his learning, but also his witness for the faith. He spent 5 years in a communist prison camp in Romania and just lived under horrible conditions where persecution was always there in some form. And he sort of brought the light of orthodoxy or Orthodox tradition into that horrible communist setting. So I do think it's at least, what he says about the Trinity is maybe at least implicit in the fathers. They don't ever connect the communion of the persons to the subject of eternity in quite the way that he does. They definitely do say that eternity, the life of God, is without interval, diastema. That's a major theme because that was part of the rejection of Arianism in the 4th century.
Right.
And they also say, in their Trinitarian theology, that there's no difference of will or knowledge or goodness or activity, energia, among the three persons. And that also is a major theme. You can find that in Athanasius as well, and certainly the Cappadocians. But I just don't recall anywhere where they sort of use that close communion of the persons to get at what eternity is.
Right.
But I do think it's a perfectly consistent and really very insightful. So I jotted down a few passages or a few sentences. He says, there's no fullness of life without fullness of communion. And because God is the fullness of life, therefore, there must be perfect communion in God. And of course, that's the communion of the persons of the Trinity. And so this communion then, that's perfect among the three persons is what God wants to offer us, to sort of invite us to share. But we're creatures. And so inevitably, because we're creatures, there is interval both between us or among us as creatures and between us and God. And that's how time is a kind of, I think this is very compatible with what I was saying a minute ago about time being the unfolding of eternity, that time is what eternity is in the way that's suitable for creatures, in the way that we as creatures are capable of living within. But at the same time, because it's an invitation to communion, it's sort of also the arena in which we transcend time and come to participate in eternity. So yeah, I think it's very profound. And also, if anyone knows this essay, I think it's just called Time and Eternity, right? Under
Eternity and Time. Yeah.
Eternity and Time. Yeah. And so publishes a little booklet. Anyway, yeah, it's a very simple, straightforward reading. Not unlike mine, not a lot of footnotes. So, yeah, but I thought it was totally compatible with what I found.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know. Something that is mentioned by Staniloae and yourself, maybe not in that essay, but I know Staniloae has a very similar passage in Volume 1 of The Experience of God. Not passage, a whole chapter, and I believe there's a section talking about time and eternity in that book. And he basically says the exact same thing. And I believe he talks about angels there. I may be wrong. I know he talks about angels and demons somewhere. And you also talk about angelic time in your essay. And I have a quote here that you say they don't have the knife edge present of temporal succession, and that they have no need of memory because in their ever-moving rest, the present good, despite moving more and more into, you could say, continual newness. Staniloae says this as well about theosis, but the present good, so every new good they have contains the past good in totality while transcending it, and this is like the ever-moving rest, right? So I was wondering if we could talk about angelic time, and maybe also if you have any thoughts on this as well, demonic time as well, because I think what Staniloae would say is that, well, for angels, since angels are created into eternity, from my understanding, they're sort of created in the direct presence of God. Unlike mankind, we we slowly move and mature towards God, but angels are created fully matured, and then they sort of have one choice: are you to choose the good and to choose evil in sort of this full knowledge or full experience of God. So when there is this choice of evil, there's a basically for an angel, a demon, there's this full withdrawal out away from communion, and then a full, as Staniloae would understand, this negation of eternity, or this movement into an eternity, which is, and this is what I think is brilliant about Staniloae's understanding, the eternity of heaven, so angelic eternity, and then the eternity of demons are both eternal. So the eternity of hell, they're both eternal, but they're eternal in exact opposite ways. So they're not symmetrical eternities, because the eternity of heaven is eternal because in time, as this interval of communion has been transcended as perfect love or full communion, so there's no time there. But hell, there is no time because there is no love at all. There's no movement out of the self. So yeah, maybe we could talk a bit about angelic time as you describe it in the essay, and what the fathers say about angelic time, and if you have any thoughts also on demonic time, or hell, time in hell and stuff, and how we understand the eternity of hell versus the eternity of heaven.
Yeah, I have to admit, so I didn't quite finish the Staniloae essay, and maybe the part about demons was more at the very end. But so far as the angels go, this is something that the fathers have a good bit to say.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, it's Gregor of Nyssa in his homilies on the Song of Songs has a passage about how the angels are eternally progressing further into the good, which is God. And this is his famous idea of perpetual progress. But the way he applies it to the angels in particular is he says that they have no need of memory because the good that was present to them before remains always present.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, it's an eternal growth. You can almost picture it, like in geometry, if you start with a point and extend it in an array, it's an eternally or ever increasing ray that remains, the whole thing is lit up. The whole thing is sort of present to their consciousness all at once. Mm-hmm. Whereas our experience of time is just a point, the present moment. And so that's a fundamental way in which the time of the angels, the fathers actually, like Basil and the Hexameron, actually refer to it as eternity. Mm-hmm. The eternity of the angels is different from our experience of time. And it is the way that they participate in divine eternity. So you have sort of two different levels of eternity. You have eternity as the divine procession that's characteristic of God himself. And then you have the way that creatures can participate in divine eternity, namely this angelic, ever-increasing good. And Gregory thinks that in the afterlife and beatitude, we too will have that same experience of eternity, as you might say, participated eternity. And for what it's worth, just a little footnote, in the West, this leads to the concept of what's called the aevum, A-E-V-U-M, which was a Latin word created by transliterating the word ion, A-I-O-N, from Greek. And I talk about in the longer paper how that really came about because John Saracen, who translated the divine names into Latin in the 12th century, he used different terms to translate aevum, or ion rather, in different places, and it gets kind of confusing. And it ends up, he kind of creates through his Latin translation this different concept that's actually not quite there in the Greek fathers. Anyway, that's a little digression, but it becomes pretty significant in Western scholasticism. But for the Greek fathers, the eternity of the angels is really very simple. It's the way that creatures participate in divine eternity. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing that Basil says in the Hexameron is that time is the image of that participated eternity. It's the image of the eternity of the angels. Mm-hmm. And that's where he is kind of adapting that idea from Plato of time being the moving image of eternity. He actually says, yeah, it's the image of the eternity of the angels. Mm-hmm. And he applies that, in the Septuagint, the creation account in Genesis 1, where it says, and the evening and the morning were the first day. In the Septuagint, it actually is a little different. It says, and the evening and the morning were one day. And he sees a lot of significance in that. He thinks that what that's indicating is that that first day of creation, which was, of course, a Sunday, already was, in a sense, the fullness of time as an image of eternity. And Sunday is sort of the day that is uniquely the image of eternity. And they connect this to the idea of the eighth day that is very prominent in the Fathers. The eighth day being eternity itself. I mean, the eternity that we enter into, which is, like I was saying, a participation in the divine eternity. But that's what time itself is an image of. And, like Basil in his, I quote a passage where he's talking about, so this is why we stand to pray on Sunday. It's not just because it's the day of the resurrection, it's because it's the day that is the image of our participating in divine eternity. So anyway, all that's true of the eternity of the angels. Now, for what it's worth about the demons, I suspect Father Staniloae is right about this, that the demons, by rejecting communion, they're rejecting eternity. They're rejecting the possibility of participating in the divine life. But they don't cease to exist. They instead enter into and maybe I haven't finished his article, right? So maybe a little off on this, but it seems to me what they're doing is they're entering into a sort of bare time that has no further potentiality of participating in eternity,
Right.
of becoming the arena in which that takes place. And so it's bare, it's nude, it's without any further capacity for communion in something higher. And that's another name for damnation. I have an article that's online, actually. It's called Facing Hard Questions About Salvation, where I ask this question about eternal damnation. How should we think about that? A lot of people want to be universalists because they think it's just unthinkable God would allow this. But it's part of freedom, to have the freedom to reject. And I picture it as kind of asymptotic in the sense that it's an ever diminishing state of being, because as you turn away from God, you're turning away from being, and you're making yourself something less and less and less with each step. But it's asymptotic because it's approaching zero, but it's also unending because it never quite reaches zero. Right. I'm not sure if Father Staniloae goes that far, but at any rate, I think he's definitely right to distinguish very sharply the way the demons experience temporality from the way the angels experience eternity.
Right. Yeah.